The story opens in Nuwayrat, a dusty village south of Cairo, where archaeologists prise the lid off a sealed clay jar and discover an intact human molar, an unassuming relic from the dawn of the Pyramid Age. That single tooth becomes the inciting incident. Inside its cementum lies the oldest complete Egyptian genome ever decoded. Suddenly, questions that have eluded scholars for generations ignite. Who were the very first Egyptians, and how far did their roots reach? As scientists race to sequence the DNA, they realize the answer could redraw the map of ancient trade, migration, and cultural exchange along the Nile. Enjoy revelations like this? Subscribe for more archaeology insights. The clay jar emerged from the desert floor, looking more like a common storage vessel than a royal reliquary. Yet its position, sealed upright in a shallow rock-cut niche, and the absence of any other grave goods, caught the excavators' attention from the moment they brushed away the last grains of sand. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal flecks in the fill pegged the burial to roughly 4,700 years ago, a heartbeat before the first limestone block of the Great Pyramid was laid. When the jar cracked open, the contents baffled the team. No amulets, no linen, no gold, just a slender skeleton in fetal pose and, lodged between jaw and palate, a molar the size of a coffee bean. Egypt's sand-swept climate usually pulverizes DNA, but the pot's low-oxygen microenvironment had turned the tooth into a genetic vault. Field notebooks were dropped for sterile gloves and liquid nitrogen flasks. 4 decades earlier, Nobel laureate Svante Pääbo had tried to coax DNA from Egyptian mummies and found nothing but dust. Heat, humidity, and embalming salts shredded the molecules long ago. That legacy of failure hung over the lab in Aberdeen when bioarchaeologist Linus Girdland Flink placed the Nuwayrat molar beneath a sterile hood. Instead of pulverizing the entire tooth, his team micro-drilled the cementum, the thin root layer that acts like a biological safe deposit box, collecting just milligrams of powder. Next came the gamble, shotgun sequencing. Rather than fishing for a handful of genetic markers, high-throughput machines would read every fragment they could grab, then assemble the jigsaw by brute force computation. The process burned through terabytes of data and days of processor time, but it paid off. 2 of 7 extracts delivered coverage across nearly the whole genome. Contamination checks showed less than 1% modern human DNA, a record for material this old. Where Pääbo had looked for threads, the new method spun an entire tapestry, one that any future researcher can now revisit without ever touching the precious tooth again. Once the genome took shape, population geneticists plunged it into a digital atlas of more than 3,000 modern and 800 ancient genomes. Every chromosome lit up with signatures of the Nile Valley, wheat-eating farmers adapted to hot, arid floodplains. But a stubborn signal kept recurring. Roughly 1/5 of the man's DNA matched Bronze Age Mesopotamians from today's Iraq and western Iran. That 80-20 split rewrites a long-running debate. For decades, scholars argued whether the founders of dynastic Egypt were purely indigenous or were Levantine migrants pushing up the Nile. The Nuwayrat genome lands squarely in the middle, overwhelmingly North African, yet undeniably seasoned with genes from the Fertile Crescent. Trade beads and pottery shards once hinted at contact. Now base pairs confirm people themselves made the journey. Isotope chemistry in the same tooth backs up the story. Ratios of strontium and oxygen, locked in as the man's enamel formed, match the geology and climate of Upper Egypt, not Mesopotamia, meaning he was born and raised on the Nile, even if some of his ancestors were not. In one stroke, The genome ties Egypt's state-building era to a wider web of migration and knowledge exchange, stretching from the Tigris to the Sahara. Long before scanners or microscopes, this man's skeleton archived his biography in calcium and cartilage. He stood a little over 5 feet, 1.55 meters, and by today's standards would have reached the equivalent of his late 80s. Exceptional longevity for the 3rd millennium BC. Genetic pigment markers point to dark skin, brown eyes, and hair, but it is the wear and tear that makes him vivid. His cervical vertebrae are compressed, the back of his skull flattened. A lifetime spent leaning forward over a rotating surface. Elbows and wrists show enlarged muscle insertions from holding weight at arm's length, while the sit bones balloon outward, classic signs of decades perched on a hard seat. Severe arthritis gnaws at the right big toe, exactly where a potter would brace against the kick wheel first adopted in Egypt around this time. Yet his internment in a sealed vessel, far more ceremonial than a craftsman could expect, hints that skill, or perhaps the luxury wares he produced, elevated him into a higher social stratum before death. The Mesopotamian sliver in the Nuwayrat genome dovetails with artifacts Egyptologists have puzzled over for decades. Cylinder seals carved in Sumerian style, Persian Gulf shell beads and cuneiform-inspired scratches on Nile-side pottery all cluster in graves from the early dynastic Old Kingdom cusp. Were those exotica passed hand to hand, or did people carry them? A man who is 4/5 North African and 1/5 Fertile Crescent finally tips the argument toward migration. Even his burial rite speaks across borders. Adult interment in a large clay jar is vanishingly rare along the Nile, yet almost routine in southern Mesopotamia at the same horizon. Unearthing one 1,000 kilometers west hints that rituals, not just commodities, traveled by caravan across the eastern desert and on precarious Red Sea hops. Chronology magnifies the stakes. Around 2650 BC, Egypt's first pyramid-building kings were centralizing labor, sharpening copper tools, and codifying hieratic script to audit grain. A trickle of foreign artisans, merchants, or accountants could have accelerated that transformation, importing the kick wheel, cylinder seal bookkeeping, and novel alloy recipes. Far from diluting pharaonic identity, the genome recasts early statehood as a cosmopolitan project, rooted in African soil, yet fertilized by innovations born on every flood and caravan. Back in a Class 100 cleanroom, technicians sandblasted the tooth's outer surface, UV sterilized it, and froze it with liquid nitrogen before micro-drilling the cementum. Each drill bit was discarded after a single pass. Blank air samples were processed alongside to catch stray modern DNA. Powder aliquots were dissolved in an enzyme cocktail that shears proteins but leaves nucleic acids intact. Silica column purification retrieved fragments a mere 40 to 70 base pairs long, typical shrapnel for genomes this ancient. Double-indexed adapters added by heat shock ligation let the team trace every read back to a specific extract and lane, flagging contamination instantly. Parallel isotope assays on neighboring enamel slices measured strontium, oxygen, and carbon, anchoring the man's childhood diet and home terrain to Upper Egypt. Osteometric scans, finally, were checked against 3D models of 200 contemporaneous skeletons, turning raw numbers into a credible life history, all before a single paragraph of the study was drafted. Nuwayrat's needle in the haystack has already reshaped sampling strategy. Survey teams now target Old Kingdom cemeteries for other clay jar burials, shaded rock-cut tombs, and high-altitude desert graves where mild temperatures can lock DNA in place. Portable clean labs let technicians drill teeth on site, slashing handling damage and paperwork. Fourth-generation sequencers, able to read longer fragments, are driving costs below a routine CT scan. Yet every extraction still consumes irreplaceable bone, so Egyptian authorities are drafting rules for minimal drilling, open data, and local scientist training. With policy and tech aligned, researchers expect dozens of equally ancient genomes within the next decade. One tooth, one genome, and a millennium-old clay jar have redrawn the borders of early Egyptian identity. The Nuwayrat man proves that Pyramid-Age Egypt was both deeply African and quietly cosmopolitan, its people and ideas flowing along the same desert corridors as gold and grain. With more genomes poised to surface, the Nile's oldest stories are only just beginning to speak.